Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, news of Malaysia inking vaccine procurement deals with pharmaceutical companies have been overshadowed by the question of how long it will take for these vaccines to be approved. Director General of Health, Dr. Nur Hisham Abdullah, had said that regulatory approval for the vaccine could take between 3 to 4 months and that the ministry is aiming for less than 90 days. But this also comes a day after Singapore already received its first shipment of vaccines, a week after it had issued regulatory approvals, as have many countries around the world. Joining us on the show tonight, we have Dr. Khor Kheng. He is one of the founders of the advocacy group, the Malaysian Healthcare Coalition. Good evening, Swee Kheng. Now, is the public consternation over the apparent sluggish vaccine approval process warranted? I'm wondering whether you think the regulatory approval timeline makes sense.
Melissa, this is a very difficult question to answer because on one hand, you have to be cautious, prudent, careful about approving a vaccine for use for 32 million people in Malaysia. So that's one reason why we should be cautious and prudent and to take our time a little bit and to insulate the NPRA or National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency from unnecessary pressure. That's on one hand. But on the other hand, we must also have a fairly accelerated route so that we can approve the vaccine in safe ways because the pandemic requires us to have an additional tool. And if vaccines are already available for us to help control the pandemic, then we should deploy these vaccines as quickly as we can.
Swee Kheng, can I ask you this? It seems that some people are saying that the timeline that's given is actually what you would normally have for any drug and without the context of a pandemic. And we know because in other countries they've had emergency authorization, they've accelerated the process. Is that not happening here? Is that what we're hearing from government?
That is not happening, Sharaad, in Malaysia, mostly because in the Malaysian context, there isn't really an emergency use authorization, or let me call it EUA, or emergency use authorization pathway that's available under local law. There is a priority review. The priority review is 90 to 120 days by the NPRA. It gives you a almost full approval. Whereas in other countries like in Singapore, they use a new pathway that was created especially for the pandemic called PSAR, or the Pandemic Special Access Route. In the US FDA, they use the emergency use authorization route as well. But EUA and PSAR is not amounting to full approval. It is an emergency use approval for a time-limited period for an extremely well-defined population, including very well-defined lots of vaccines as well, and not a blanket approval for the vaccine to be used throughout the entire population. So the emergency use authorization is not a substitute for full approval. And in Malaysia, perhaps we should consider having a accelerated pathway in parallel to the priority review process that we have that leads to full approval for the vaccine.
Swee Kheng, do you think that this hesitancy or this I guess taking the proper steps, the 90-day approval process, do you think that can be seen as us adopting a wait and see approach? No, a wait and see approach to see if there are problems, to see whether there's side effects, to learn from the mistakes of other countries. And I'm wondering if that is the approach, then what is the trade-off to that this reluctance, this hesitancy? There's bound to be trade-offs to this delay.
Melissa, to answer that question, I first have to provide an additional context. An additional context is that the MHRA, or the regulator in the UK that approved the Pfizer vaccine, the first regulatory agency to approve it in the world, really, they benefited from rolling submissions from the Pfizer, the company, over a 6-month period leading up to approval. So it's only last week that the NPRA in Malaysia received the full dossier, and as dossiers continue to come in for the 6 or 7 vaccine companies that were contracted to, I think the process could be a little faster than that. But to go back to your question, we can decouple this, say, period of delay or period of waiting period for approval, decouple that from an actual conscious decision to adopt a wait and see approach. So I would think that these are separate entities. Okay. And to your question, Melissa, it is a very difficult trade-off for NPRA at the moment. They've convened a group of experts to advise them. And in that particular trade-off, on one hand, speed could mean that we save lives, but some amount of slowness would mean that we're actually increasing public confidence. So it's a very delicate balance to be struck, and there'll be a whole list of criteria that our experts in the NPRA will have to consider as they find the right balance between speed and rigor of approval.
Speaking, do you think we kind of dropped the ball at some point in time? Why have other countries either created legislative enabling laws to accelerate this process, or have created, in many countries we hear, of course, of infrastructure systems being built and put into place? Have we done any of that, and should we have done it by now?
We have done some of the infrastructure building, Sharaad. I think we can always do a lot more. And the infrastructure building, as you have alluded to, happens in two ways. One is a legal and regulatory infrastructure to allow an accelerated approval for batches of vaccines in order for it to be deployed to Malaysia. And hidden, not hidden, but rather embedded within the legal and regulatory infrastructure is the clinical trial infrastructure, the manufacturing infrastructure, and the good manufacturing practices infrastructure, or GMP, so that we can have our own factories produce vaccines for ourselves, including for Southeast Asia, as what has been done in Siam Biosciences, that have technology transfers from AstraZeneca for them to produce vaccines for Southeast Asia. That's on a legal and the regulatory infrastructure. But you're also right about spending the time in the last few months. We could have spent that differently. We can definitely spend the next few months very differently as well. If the first batches of the vaccine will come in February, then now is the time for us to begin the physical infrastructure building for cold chains, the delivery mechanisms of doctors that need to be trained and nurses that need to be trained. How do we use the 7,800 general practice clinics, or GP clinics, in the private sector in Malaysia that deliver a large bulk of immunizations in Malaysia, and how do we utilize that as well? So it's not just a cold chain infrastructure, but the human capital infrastructure, integration between public and private, and if you're even more ambitious, the financing infrastructure, because this might not be the last round of vaccinations. There could be mutations, there could be strains that become endemic. We may have to vaccinate a second and the third time, even in the same calendar year. These are all infrastructure that can be built beginning today.
Okay. So Malaysia's inked several different agreements with several different pharmaceutical companies, also with COVAX. And I'm wondering, Swee, does it make sense for a country to purchase different vaccines? I mean, each of these vaccines have varying efficacy and also varying durations of immunity. What happens when we think through mass vaccination programs of different types of vaccines?
Melisa, this is a question with, say, very difficult trade-offs again. So the least imperfect solution is to have a portfolio of vaccines. Let me invent the alternative scenario that Malaysia is dependent on one company. Let's call it Company X. It doesn't matter to me what company it is. Let's call it Company X. Then we're beholden to the company who may be able to exert price controls over us, or to be able to dictate prices over us. Secondly, if there's a manufacturing or supply disruption, then Malaysia would be affected. Thirdly, Malaysia will be competing for the supplies for this particular company alongside other countries in the world. And already we see that Canada has got enough vaccines to vaccinate the population about 10 times over. Australia is trying to compete with Canada by purchasing vaccines up to 8 to 10 times the population as well. So it's a very difficult situation for Malaysia just to get vaccine supplies from one company. And it's got its own, say, challenges as well. Right. So the least imperfect solution is to have a portfolio of vaccines, because it guarantees us the supplies, availability. Secondly, we will be able to, shall we say, get to 80% coverage, or in today's announcement, up to 83% coverage in a very short period of time, which scientifically and epidemiologically makes sense for us to achieve herd immunity. But there will be trade-offs. The trade-offs would be different price points, different safety levels, different efficacy levels, different approvals, different, say, availability, times of availability as well. All this will probably have to be fit into a model that I'm reasonably certain that the government would have in place already, in order for us to deploy these vaccines in a safe and effective and very timely fashion as well. So all things being equal, Melisa, this is probably the least imperfect solution available to us in this world where everybody is racing for the vaccine supplies.
Speaking of world, the vaccines come from all corners of the globe, it seems. And because in the coffee shops around the country, people are asking themselves, hey, would you take the Russian one? Would you take the Chinese one? Would you take the so on and so forth? Should we be concerned about the origins of those vaccines? Is that how a scientist, a doctor, a professional like yourself thinks through the origins of a vaccine?
Sharaad, I'll begin by saying that I trust my colleagues in the National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency. If the NPRA approves a vaccine for use, then I will trust that their judgment is accurate and based on the best available data that's available to them, and they've judged the trade-offs already. So I want to give a vote of confidence to the National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency. I will take a vaccine that is approved by the NPRA, regardless of the country in which it comes from. So that was a clear statement that I would like to make. However, Sharaad, there would be approvals aside, all vaccines are different from one another. The safety profile is different. The temperature variations are different. The effectiveness or efficacy levels will be different as well. And the average citizen is justified in asking questions of, will I be getting vaccines from country A or company A, or vaccines from company B or country B? And these questions are very difficult to resolve. Now that we've got a portfolio, we've got a new problem to think about. And the problem is one of delivery, the equitable distribution, even the vaccine confidence ones. This pandemic that we have right now is a multi-year problem with multiple problems. So you fix one problem, you get to graduate or move on to the next problem. And I think this is something for us to consider as well. These are good problems to have, Sharaad, better than not having any vaccines.
So Kheng, you said the imperfect solution, right? Trying to pick the most imperfect solution. I'm wondering, do you think that people should be given a choice of what vaccine they want? Because, the science and the technology that goes into a vaccine or goes behind the vaccine different. The mRNA versus the adenovirus-driven vaccines versus the inactivated virus. Should people have a say in what kind of vaccines they receive?
Melisa, it was the least imperfect solution, not the most imperfect.
Okay, so the least imperfect solution, you're right.
No problems. Just to emphasize that fact. Now, about choice in healthcare, I'd like to go big and then go very small, right? In very big picture terms, healthcare is paternalistic. Paternalistic in the sense that a doctor with an asymmetry of knowledge and information, when talking to a patient, would try to advise the patient to do what's best for the patient's health. And we have code of ethics, we have malpractice in order to check the doctor. There are various systems in place to ensure that the doctor does the best for the patient. And when I say doctor, I mean all healthcare professionals, not just doctors. And that's, I guess, a big picture for how decisions are often made for health for the average citizen. But let's zoom in into the vaccine. In the ideal situation, yes, I believe that people should be deserving of a choice for which vaccine to receive. However, there would be scientific considerations, availability considerations, supply chain considerations, and efficacy considerations as well that we have to put into the picture. So it could be that while we, in theory, want to offer choice, if the first batches of the vaccine that comes in belongs to company A, and healthcare providers are who we deem to be the most important and therefore should receive the first installments, then the theoretical argument remains, but in practical terms, healthcare providers will get vaccines from company A, right, and the senior citizens will get vaccines from company B, and so on and so forth, because the practicalities of it are perhaps more important than the theoretical parts of it at the moment.
Swee Kheng, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We're going to take a quick break, but after this, we'll come back with more on this conversation, so stay tuned. Hi, thanks for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Is the complexity of vaccine and drug procurement driving much of the public confusion and misinformation? Added to it, the scale and delivery conditions required to effectively inoculate the population. Joining us on the show now, we have Azrul Muhammad Khalib. He is the CEO of Galen Centre for Health and Social Policy. Azrul, good evening. Now, you had a press statement today, and in it, you note that Malaysia seems to be on track in its management of the COVID-19 vaccines, But you also note that we've had a late start in procurement and the approval process. Azrul, what accounts for this late start?
Well, I think the government of Malaysia was taking a much more cautious stance when it came to looking at possible vaccine candidates to take into its stable of possible vaccines to be rolled out to the Malaysian population. So I think they were much more cautious. They were looking at other countries, what was going on in those countries, and most importantly, whether or not those vaccines provided with the necessary safety and efficacy data as necessary for a vaccine to be approved and made available in the country. So I think they erred on the side of caution, which is why they started late.
Azrul, this cautious approach, I'm sure there are trade-offs because now we are behind the curve when it comes to the vaccine rollout.
Well, this is the dilemma that a lot of countries around the world have had to face when dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Many of the vaccines that are available are still in development. There are more than 170 vaccine candidates in the pipeline, and when you think about it, only one is really ready for prime time and to be able to be rolled out. And this is a remarkable compressed timeline, which usually takes years in order for them to be able to develop, but because of the new technologies and new platform approaches that are available to the manufacturing of vaccines, we're able to roll it out fairly quick. But this is the problem today, is that a lot of the data that you need to properly evaluate and look at a pharmaceutical product are just not available. Out of the vaccines that have been announced by the Malaysian government today, for example, which I think there were 5 vaccines that Malaysia is looking to roll out for 2021, out of which only 3 have actually been signed on for, only one actually has a complete dossier for the National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency to look at. So realistically, only one vaccine is going to be realistically considered to be approved for 2021, and that is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine.
But Azrul, so should Malaysians not look with envy across the causeway and say, well, the Singaporeans announced their Pfizer deal later than us, but they've actually got the vaccines in the country and are going to be putting it into people's arms? I mean, should we be envious, or should we just say, well, they're probably, erred on the side of speed rather than caution?
Well, honestly, Sharaad, when I saw the images coming from Changi Airport yesterday night, I was envious. I was totally jealous of our neighbors of being able to not just approve the vaccine in a very speedy manner, but also to be able to receive these vaccines. And the thing is that obviously a lot of work had already gone months before that moment came yesterday. It was definitely not when the Prime Minister announced on television that the vaccines had been approved. Obviously, the Singaporean government had gone into negotiations with Pfizer manufacturer to be able to secure those vaccines before the announcement was made. So, I wish we had started a lot earlier concerning the conversation about securing the necessary vaccines for the Malaysian population. But the point is, we're here today. We can see a possible glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, and this is the good thing, is that we're starting 2021 with at least 1 or 3 vaccines in Malaysia's portfolio of vaccines to be able to start rolling out to the Malaysian population. Right. So we can look at least for the first quarter to be receiving at least 1 million vaccines for rollout.
Azrul, speaking about the public conversations about the vaccine, I'm wondering whether the conversations around the cost of the vaccine has made sense to you, especially since there's been revelation of vaccine prices by Belgium.
Well, one of the things that's been a little bit of a misinformation concerning that revelation was the exclusion or the fact that those were obtained through pool procurement. And the fact is that the European Union, which has a population of more than 440 million people, which is more than the US population, is able to leverage on the volume of the vaccine orders to be able to get a much more lower price. And it is important to note that the prices that were made available through Twitter the other day was for a single dose, not for a double dose. Most of these vaccines require a double dose in order for it to be effective. So you need to times those numbers by 2 in order for you to get the actual price in which they're paying for the COVID-19 vaccine. So in the case of Malaysia, I would say is that with a population of 32 million, the price that the government has been able to seemingly obtain is a pretty good one, especially since the price that has been, or the deal that has been worked out between Pfizer and the Malaysian government includes the logistical costs, including the delivery of the vaccine to vaccination sites, which is not included in the EU prices that were publicly known.
Right.
Azrul, delivery is going to be a huge part of the success of any kind of vaccination program. And just watching how Britain has done it, identifying hospitals, building those, centers for the quick delivery of a vaccine that needs to get from factory to arm in less than 5 days. Do you think that we have that infrastructure in place today? And, have you heard about the preparations for identifying vulnerable populations in care homes and so on and so forth that are needed for this to be done in a very kind of efficient way?
So, the deal that the government has made with Pfizer is to ensure the safe delivery of these vaccines from the point of its Brussels factory to the vaccination sites in Malaysia. And that's a great deal. But what I'm worried about is really what you just mentioned there, which is the enormity, the scale of the rollout of these vaccines, which honestly we have never seen before. In fact, very few countries around the world have actually seen. And today we are faced with not only the impending task of vaccinating our population, but also dealing with the ongoing outbreak of COVID-19. So the same people who are involved in those activities are occupied today with dealing with the outbreak. So I'm worried because there seems to be no sharing by the government as to where or what plans are being put into motion, whether there have been rehearsals on how to roll out these vaccines, and most importantly, the plan in which to identify prioritized individuals for the vaccine.
Azrul, what would you like to see? What would you like to see the government attempt to do at this point in time before we actually have the rollout, especially in the scale of this vaccination program?
Well, I think one of the first things that the government needs to do is to share the plan for the vaccine rollout. And if you see in many other countries, in Singapore, in the UK, in the US, that information has been shared with the public, and most importantly, the healthcare professionals who are going to be involved in the rollout of the vaccines. And it is important for us to ensure that that plan is transparent, is clear, and most importantly, is understandable, especially when it comes to who will get prioritized to receive the vaccine at the very beginning of this rollout. And another point I want to really mention is that this should not be just the whole of government approach. It needs to be a whole of society approach. And that involves including the private healthcare sector in the rollout of this vaccine. It cannot be just the government and the public healthcare sector just taking on the burden and responsibility for this rollout. This must include the private healthcare, which constitutes around 50% of our healthcare sector, that we are going to be able to utilize their strength and capacity to be able to vaccinate as many Malaysians, as many people in this country as possible, so that we can beat back the outbreak as it is today.
Azrul, it's interesting that you mentioned the private healthcare system as a partner in this rollout, but what about the idea that the private healthcare system might actually provide an alternative route, especially when the priorities set by government don't necessarily match the priorities of private individuals, say for those who are still young, in demographics that are not risky, but also need to fly, for instance, for work and whatever, and for whom a vaccination will be necessary. Is there a role for a kind of double tracking of the vaccination process?
There definitely is going to be a time when we're going to be able to not only have double tracking of the vaccination rollout, but also a choice of which vaccine that we would like to be vaccinated with. Unfortunately, that time is nowhere near, at least in the next 6 months of 2021. What we're going to be seeing is that we're going to be able to only take the vaccines that are going to be available for Malaysia based on the deals that we have made. And for the moment, it is the vaccines that have already been identified by the government. And this
very
will
quick,
be
sorry.
rolled out through the public healthcare sector.
Right. So, Azrul, sorry, we're running out of time. Very quickly, what could go terribly wrong with this process? Azrul, have you lost you?
Yes, okay, I hear you now.
Yeah, what could go wrong? What could go terribly wrong?
One of the things that we are concerned about right now are anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy has always been present in the Malaysian population, but as a result of a lot of confusion, misinformation, and disinformation that's happening today, we believe that vaccine hesitancy is actually on the rise today. And this is something that we, not only the government, but we ourselves as members of society need to be able to play a role to push back, because we need people, as many people as possible, to be vaccinated against COVID-19, and we cannot afford people to hesitate or consider themselves above the vaccination effort. We need to push back against both anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitancy.
Azrul, thank you so much for your time joining us on the show, sharing your insights. We appreciate it. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.